Let everyone in. I'm going to start it in the group view, and then I'm going to go to the zoomed in view.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to give it a minute or two as people join, and then we'll get started.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. My phone rang and sometimes it cuts out, but I sent it to voicemail.
No problem. Okay, we've got lots of people here. We'll just wait one more minute and then we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. Okay, well, we've got a lot to do today, so we might as well get into it. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Ethan Cox, and I'm one of Brandi's editors at Ricochet Media. I'll be moderating this press conference and introducing each speaker, but first I'd like to share a brief statement from our outlet. On January 10th, Brandi was reporting on an Edmonton police raid on an Indigenous encampment. She was one of several people filming in the immediate area, and yet a police officer, Sergeant Amber Mays, targeted her. Mays ignored others filming and came directly at Brandi, demanding she leave the area. When Brandi tried to explain she was a journalist, Mays arrested her. Brandi was also told that charging her was Mays's decision. It's also important to mention here that Brandi is, by anyone's definition, one of this country's most celebrated journalists. Her most recent journalistic honors include an Edward R. Murrow Award for Investigative Journalism, the PEN Canada Ken Filko Prize for Advancing Freedom of Expression in Canada, an Amnesty International Award for Human Rights Reporting, and the top long feature award at last year's Digital Publishing Awards. Morin is also an award-winning author. At no time did Brandi obstruct any police officer. On the contrary, she was obstructed and then arrested while trying to film the raid. She was not in the way, she was not involved, and she should never have been removed in handcuffs, let alone charged. Sergeant Mays is a former Wild Rose Party candidate, a now defunct far-right provincial party in Alberta. We don't know why Brandi was targeted in this way. We don't know why Sergeant Mays decided to stop her from reporting, and we don't know why Sergeant Mays decided to charge her with obstruction, a charge that typically requires the offender to physically interfere with a police officer, something Brandi did not do. But there are only two explanations that we can see at Ricochet. Either Mays targeted Brandi because she recognized her and wanted to shut down reporting on these arrests by a high-profile journalist, or she didn't recognize Brandi, but saw that she looked Indigenous and assumed that meant she was part of the predominantly Indigenous encampment. Neither explanation is acceptable. It's now been over 2 weeks since Brandi was arrested, and yet we know that Mays has yet to produce any statement or other documentation to support the charge of obstruction. This charge is absurd, and it's highly unlikely that a court will convict Brandi. But even if the charge is withdrawn tomorrow, a great deal of damage has been done to Brandi, and there needs to be accountability for that. Even Edmonton Mayor Amarjeet Sohi was unusually blunt in a statement responding to the police raid that resulted in Morin's arrest. He said, "Recent actions at encampment clearances may not be in line with the city's commitment to upholding reconciliation and its obligation of care in communities across the city." The law is clear. High courts in 2 provinces and even the RCMP's own oversight body have all found that broad exclusion zones and other police efforts to prevent journalists from reporting on their actions are unlawful. The press must have access to report on the actions of police. It is, after all, the primary mechanism we have for democratic accountability. In a groundbreaking lawsuit, World Press Photo of the Year winning photojournalist Amber Bracken is suing the RCMP over her arrest and detention while reporting on Wet'suwet'en in opposition to the CGL pipeline. Charges against her were swiftly dropped, but the lawsuit is ongoing and could cost the federal government a significant amount of money. Why are we putting taxpayer money at risk to protect the police's ability to hide their actions from public view? While it is unusual to see a journalist charged, it is unfortunately not all that unusual for police forces to arrest journalists in order to disrupt their reporting and then quietly drop or never file charges. This behavior needs to stop. Journalism is not a crime. Brandi is not a criminal. This charge must be dropped immediately, and the elected representatives responsible for this police force, namely Edmonton Mayor Amarjeet Sohi and his city council and Alberta Premier Daniel Smith, need to explain to the public how this happened and what they're doing to ensure it never happens again. When the police target journalists and seek to impede their reporting, they're targeting the public's right to know. That should be of deep concern to us all. We'll move on now to today's speakers. We're very proud to have the support today of virtually all the major national and international journalism and press freedom groups, including the Canadian Association of Journalists, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, the Indigenous Journalists Association, Journalists for Human Rights, the Coalition for Women in Journalism, and Amnesty International. PEN Canada were unable to join us today, but they are, as we speak, releasing a statement via Newswire and on their website calling for these charges to be dropped, and we'll make that available as well. We'll also be using the hashtag #StandWithBrandi on social media platforms and encouraging members of the public to tag the Edmonton Police and Edmonton Mayor Amarjeet Sohi in their tweets. This is really an unprecedented show of unity from the journalism community, and we want to thank all of today's speakers and the organizations they represent for standing with us. Clayton Wiemers, the executive director of Reporters Without Borders in North America, has to leave early due to a prior commitment, so we'll hear from him first. Then we'll hear from Brandi's lawyer, Richard Morasti, representatives of the other groups I mentioned, and finally, Brandi herself. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So without further ado, Clayton Wiemers, executive director, Reporters Without Borders, US and Canada, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you for that really excellent synopsis of this case. And I think you really said it all. For Reporters Without Borders, the position here is clear. Brandi Morin must not be prosecuted for doing her job as a journalist. Brandi did everything by the book. She was reporting on a matter of clear public interest, and maybe that's inconvenient for the police, but that's no justification for infringing on her rights as a reporter and the public's right to know what is happening in their community. As the world's largest NGO devoted to the right to information, RSF is known for ranking every country by its press freedom score, and Canada has historically been a global leader in that regard. Setting legal precedents like this is the kind of thing that puts that leadership in jeopardy. The charge against Brandi is reminiscent of the RCMP's arrest and detention of Amber Bracken in 2021, as Ethan mentioned in his description. Let's not allow arrests of journalists covering police actions and matters of public interest to become a trend in Canada. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Clayton. Next up, we have Richard Morasti, who is a veteran Cree criminal defense lawyer in Edmonton with RRM Law and Brandi's lawyer. He's just going to give us a little bit more information about the legal situation. Richard, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I also have to leave somewhat early, so I'm glad I get to speak right away. As of this morning, I checked with the disclosure office, and there is no disclosure available yet. The disclosure is the police notes, the police narrative, any video or audio witness statements, civilian witness, police witness. And that's anyone accused of an offense is entitled to that by case law, R versus Stitchcomb. I have yet to receive anything. I also checked on Roy Cardinal's disclosure to see if his was ready, and that's showing the same result, not available. Please check back later. I also spoke with the assigned crown. The assigned crown is a very senior crown to this file. I checked with him on Friday. And I said, there's a press conference on Monday. I need to know what's happening with the disclosure. He said, I'll check, but it's probably being vetted. And we both are in agreement, the defense lawyer and myself, that this is not the crime of the century. So the disclosure would be minimal. It shouldn't take that long. However, I'm just looking at my notes here. He's going to get back to me this afternoon to see what's happening with the disclosure. So that's about all I can offer at this point. It's unusual it takes that long. Sometimes it does, but it's really for major cases, but not cases like like this, a simple obstruction. So we'll see where it goes.
Thank you, Richard. Before you go, one question. Could you just tell everyone what the legal definition of the charge is, the charge of obstruction?
I will. I have my criminal code right in front of me, and I will read it to you verbatim. 129A of the criminal code. Offenses relating to public or a peace officer. Everyone who resists or willfully obstructs a police officer or peace officer in the execution of his duty, or any person lawfully acting in the aid of such officer, is guilty of D, an indictable offense, or E, an offense summary by an offense punishable by summary conviction. That's how it reads. And there's a narrative right behind there, how I can, the term willfully does not have a fixed meaning. And there's a bunch of case law on this. Interestingly enough, I ran across an article that's quite dated about this is not the first time this has happened, obviously. So there's been journalists arrested before. There's been people arrested in picket lines charged with the same offense. But that's what the section reads. And a synopsis: the section creates an offense for, and this is in italics, willfully obstructing or resisting a peace officer or a public officer or a person assisting that in the execution of his duties. So I guess they would have to show that Brandi was obstructing Sergeant Mays in some way.
And in fact, the opposite happened. In fact, Mays came up to Brandi and obstructed her. So it's going to be very difficult for them to establish that happened when nothing of the sort happened.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Richard. I know you have to run off to court, but for any journalists on the call, we can connect you to Richard by phone later today if you have questions. So just let us know, and we can get you his phone number. Thank you. Richard.
Call me after 1 Mountain Time. I'll be available to take calls then. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you.
All right. Moving on, we have Brent Jolly, president of the Canadian Association of Journalists. Take it away, Brent.
Thanks, Ethan. Good morning, everybody, or perhaps good afternoon, depending on wherever you're joining us for this press conference today. My name is Brent Jolly, and I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Journalists. First of all, I'd just like to say and begin by expressing how, frankly, disappointed I am that we need this press conference today. It's an incredibly sad reflection on the current state of press freedom in Canada to be standing here. It's a great story that we're coming together to support Brandi, but I think it's certainly an indictment on the current system that we're even needing to do this in the first place. As Ethan said, on January 10th, Brandi was arrested by the Edmonton police while reporting on a raid at a primarily Indigenous encampment for the unhoused. Let me be blunt and unequivocal. Based on all the evidence, Brandi was targeted and singled out for doing her job as a journalist. Today, she appears with us here, charged with obstruction, which, as was just noted by Richard, is a criminal offense that carries a maximum sentence of 2 years in prison. Brandi's arrest makes an absolute mockery of the rights of freedom of the press and the ability for journalists to report on the activities of taxpayer-funded law enforcement agencies, such as the Edmonton Police Service. My colleagues are here today for a simple purpose. We're calling for any charges against Brandi to be dropped immediately. This entire situation is an abomination, I should say, particularly as a result and towards the pursuit of reconciliation and justice, and must be corrected immediately. The brazen actions by the Edmonton Police Service are sadly just the latest examples of a self-imposed black eye in an ever-growing number of examples where law enforcement agencies of Canada have ignored, whether through ignorance or indifference, the valuable role journalists play in a free and democratic society. This pattern of behavior must be stopped in its tracks right now. That's why the CAJ, and on behalf of the CAJ, I'm calling on all law enforcement agencies in Canada, regardless of their jurisdiction, to immediately take the steps necessary to ensure that press freedom and the safety of journalists are protected. And that begins today by dropping these absolutely absurd charges against our colleague Brandi Morin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brent. Moving on, we have Catherine Jacobson, U.S. and Canada Program Coordinator with the Committee to Protect Journalists. All you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Ethan. As you said, my name is Catherine Jacobson, and I lead the U.S. and Canada program at the Committee to Protect Journalists. We're a global organization that advocates for freedom of the press and tracks attacks on journalists worldwide. We're very concerned by the behavior of the Edmonton police toward Brandi Morin on January 10th and local law enforcement's decision to press charges against her, despite the evidence that she was not in violation of Canadian law at the time of her arrest, as Ethan detailed so nicely at the beginning of this call. Rather, Brandi was simply doing her job and covering a matter of local importance, a police raid. At the Committee to Protect Journalists, our research shows that arresting reporters serves as a blunt form of censorship. A journalist in handcuffs cannot get their story out. And beyond an initial detention, prosecuting reporters creates a harmful chilling effect and serves as a form of intimidation for their peers. Lengthy and expensive legal processes take time away from reporters and limit their ability to cover their communities. It is vital that law enforcement immediately and unequivocally drop the charges against Brandi and take measures to make sure that this does not happen again. Journalism is not a crime. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Just a reminder that we will have an opportunity to have questions for any of the speakers after everyone's statements. Next, we have Angel Ellis, the treasurer with the Indigenous Journalists Association.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I also serve as a chair for our new Free Press Committee that is tracking this issue. And the Indigenous Journalists Association supports Brandi Morin, who was arrested by Edmonton police while covering the removal of a homeless encampment. IJA echoes the Canadian Association of Journalists in calling on all levels of law enforcement agencies in Canada to swiftly implement enforceable policies to prevent journalists from being improperly arrested and detained, and to stop attacks on press freedom. It must end now. Morin is a mother and an award-winning journalist, a professional member of the IJA and Indigenous Media Awards winner. Her journalism community supports her storytelling and stands with her during this difficult time. IJA has a membership of over 900 members, and we're with you today, Brandi. IJA calls for the criminal obstruction charges against her to be dropped. Indigenous journalists must be free to report on our communities and share our people's voices on our traditional territories. Storytelling is an inherent right and an integral part of our right to self-determination, which must be recognized by colonial settlers and their entities. IJA would like to call on them to drop these charges immediately and remember that journalism is an aspect of democracy and it must be protected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angel. Next, we have Bill Killorn, the Interim Executive Director with Journalists for Human Rights.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you, everyone else. My name is Bill Killorn, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights. We are an international human rights and media development organization, but we're headquartered in Canada. I will keep my remarks brief because they largely echo the sentiments of others on the call, but I will say that journalism is a fundamental pillar of democracy. In their pursuit of truth and accountability, journalists play a vital role as a check and balance on power and authority. It is a challenging job that often puts journalists in uncomfortable or unsafe situations, especially when they are covering issues of conflict with authorities. But journalists do this work to benefit all of us, to benefit citizens, so we can be better informed on the issues that impact our lives and our society. The incident we are talking about today is not only a violation of Brandi Morin's rights, but also an alarming indication of the challenges and dangers faced by journalists globally. Journalists for Human Rights is proud to stand with Brandi Morin and journalists around the world in their work documenting events and maintaining transparency in democratic societies. Democracy is not something we should take for granted. It's something we need to work at, and that work includes gathering together to call out overreach of authorities. It also means covering issues of public importance like encampments, because encampments like the ones we're talking about in Edmonton are present in communities across Canada, and the economic and societal forces that cause them are not going away anytime soon. This is an issue that we need to face together in a safe, just, and accountable way, not in an aggressive, intimidating, and adversarial manner. GHR is proud to add our voice to those on the call and asking for the charges to be immediately dropped against Brandi Morin, and asks for a climate of patience and cooperation and space to be given to journalists as they continue to cover this issue and other challenging issues across Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Next, we have Karan Nazish, Founding Director, Women Press Freedom at the Coalition for Women in Journalism.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you for everyone who's here. Like Ethan said, my name is Karan Nazish. I'm the Founding Director of the Coalition for Women in Journalism and Women Press Freedom, which is our press freedom initiative. We're based out of New York, but we work around the world. And one of the core things that we do at Women Press Freedom is to monitor and document harassment against women, press freedom harassments against women and non-binary journalists. So I am here, I'm joining this call and, alongside all of my colleagues here, first of all, I'd like to note that we want these charges against Brandi to be dropped. Women Press Freedom condemns the arrest and the charges. We demand that the charges are dropped against Brandi Morin. This is not the first time she has actually been targeted by the police. There have been several incidents where Brandi has been, while doing her work covering Indigenous stories and stories related to Indigenous issues and climate change, she has been targeted by the RCMP and police. In the last few years, we've documented several cases where Brandi alone was targeted through police or RCMP. We see that journalists covering, stories that are related to Indigenous issues and climate change are usually the ones that are dominant when it comes to police impediment or RCMP impeding, law enforcement impeding journalists. And I wanted to sort of give you a little sense of since 2019, the numbers of violations of women journalists that women journalists have faced in Canada. The overall violations of press freedom attacks against women journalists alone in Canada is 70. 36 of those are online online attacks, smear campaigns, etc. And then 16 press freedom violations that are more general, where women journalists are covering protests or any kind of story on the ground, and they get targeted with different kinds of press freedom attacks. But 17, since 2019, 17 press freedom violations came from police or RCMP and law enforcement. That is a huge number for a country that is actually a little higher on the global press freedom data. So we call this particular case that Brandi is facing, the charges against Brandi as well, a case of police impediment against the journalist, and that turned into a legal case. So there are this case for us falls into two categories, and we are concerned about both the police impediment and that it has become a legal case. Most of all, we do not think it is healthy for Canadian democracy to have law enforcement institutions get in the way of journalistic work. Their job is to allow journalists access and to get out of the way of independent news gathering, which is a process necessary for a democracy. Of course, there is no doubt that police and law enforcement institutions need internal discussions on how to improve their treatment of journalists, but to make that happen, we call upon public officials to help push for this. We think that democratic leadership in Canada should take this seriously and join us in discouraging the police and law enforcement institutions targeting journalists like this. Most of all, we at Women Press Freedom would like these charges to be dropped against Brandi Morin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have David Mazzini, Director of Policy Advocacy and Research with Amnesty International Canada.
Thank you, Ethan. I'm honored to speak today in support of journalist Brandi Morin. Brandi is one of the boldest and most important journalists reporting on human rights in Canada today. Without her courageous, thoughtful, and empathetic reporting, our collective understanding of the human rights landscape in Canada, especially with respect to the rights of Indigenous nations, would be poorer. Our painstaking reporting has earned us several prestigious journalism honors, including one that came from Amnesty International Media Awards last year. We are not here to discuss Brandi's accomplishments today, however. We are here to speak out in defense of our rights, the rights of journalists across Canada and the world, and the right we all share to fact-based reporting about issues concerning public interest. To put it plainly, journalists have a right to do their job, and we're here to support them. And we, as the public, have the right to know, have the right to be informed through the work of journalists. Journalism and free press are protected under Article 19 of the UN International Convention of Civil and Political Rights, which Canada has been party to since 1976. All these rights are echoed in the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Brandi's arrest is an attack on these deeply important and well-established legal rights and standards. It sends a chilling message to journalists reporting on critical human rights issues, such as policing, homelessness, political protest, and corporate accountability. As a democratic republic, we lose out when journalists and news organizations are prevented from reporting the toughest stories in the country, particularly where people's human rights are on the line. It should be noted that Brandi is an Indigenous woman journalist whose reporting focuses on the rights of Indigenous peoples and nations. Her arrest, along with the arrest of Carl Dockstader and Amber Bracken at Indigenous Land Defense Actions in Toronto and BC, respectively, suggest a pattern of prejudice and criminalization against Indigenous journalists and non-Indigenous journalists with rich ties to Indigenous nations. The implications, not just for Indigenous journalists, but for the protection of Indigenous rights generally, are deeply concerning. In sum, we urged Edmonton police to drop all the charges against her and apologize to her, issue a public apology to all Canadians and journalists. The harassment and criminalization of journalists like Brandi has no place in a democratic society, and the targeting of journalists reporting on Indigenous rights threatens Canada's fragile progress on the road to reconciliation. Brandi, we thank you for your courageous work, and we are here with you, holding hands with you, and we support all of your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to go to Brandi herself for a statement. I just wanted to remind folks before we do that there will be an opportunity to ask questions to any of today's speakers after Brandi's statement. Go ahead, Brandi.
Tanse, hello, bonjour, everybody. I'm coming to you from the traditional lands of my ancestors of the Michelle First Nation in Treaty 6. I'm a mother, daughter, and granddaughter, as well as a journalist and author. I've been a journalist full-time for nearly 15 years, and I've been telling exclusively Indigenous stories for 11 years. I am committed to telling the truths of the stories of Native communities, which often involve stories of reconciliation, the environment, culture, and traditions. Most of the time, I'm on the front lines of conflicts between Indigenous peoples and colonial authorities. I document the ongoing injustices and human rights violations experienced by too many Indigenous communities. On Wednesday, January 10th, I was at an Indigenous-led homeless encampment along Roland Road near Edmonton's downtown core. I needed in-depth one-on-one interviews with individuals living in the camp, as well as supporters on site for a story I was working on, which brought me there in the capacity of my profession as a journalist. I had been there the day before when police walked through the encampment in order to determine a strategy to dismantle it, as it was identified by the city of Edmonton as high risk. After negotiating with the camp leader, Roy Cardinal, that day, police escorted city workers in to dismantle structures that were unoccupied. I observed the police agreeing with Roy Cardinal and advocates there to leave the occupied tents alone. Shortly before noon on Wednesday, January 10th, that next day, while I was inside Roy Cardinal's teepee, along with his invited guests, conducting an interview, we were informed Edmonton police were amassing outside. I put my interview on hold and went outside. I saw police officers setting up a large exclusion zone around the camp's boundaries with yellow crime scene tape. I then posted 2 short video updates to my X account advising of the unfolding situation. As an Indigenous reporter who regularly witnesses and reports on police brutality against Indigenous peoples, it's my responsibility to use my platform to inform the public and to hold to account those in power, such as the police. Less than 10 minutes after I came out of my interview in the teepee, a line of police officers had gathered on a small mound overlooking the camp. I recorded from my iPhone what was unfolding. Roy, other people living in the encampment, and supporters formed a line on the opposite side of the police. An officer informed Roy the group had the opportunity to leave peacefully or would be forcibly removed and could face charges of obstruction. A confrontation soon erupted after Roy refused to leave his home encampment. Police moved to arrest Roy, and a chaotic scene unfolded. My camera was rolling as people screamed, some put their hands in the air, and others attempted to shield Roy from being plummeted by police. Within seconds, while my camera was still rolling, Sergeant Amber Mays targeted me, singling me out among several people filming. She stepped in front of my camera and told me I had to leave. I replied I was a journalist and had a right to be there. I also stated I was not impeding the work of the police. Sergeant Mays began pushing me back while the police were jumping on Roy to subdue him and working to forcibly disperse the crowd of supporters. She told me I had to move behind the yellow line. That yellow line, the crime scene tape they'd put up around the premises, was too far away for me to witness police actions. It was at least 50 feet away from where the police were conducting their raid. Now, having had extensive experience working amidst police crackdowns on Indigenous land defenders and Indigenous rights conflicts where police have used media exclusion zones, I know they are unlawful. Media exclusion zones are sometimes used by RCMP and police to control the movement of journalists and prohibit us from doing our jobs. In a 2021 BC Supreme Court ruling, Justice Douglas Thompson rebuked the RCMP for the use of exclusion zones to control the movement of journalists, calling the tactic unlawful. After asserting my rights as a member of the press and refusing to leave, I was handcuffed while surrounded by 3 officers, including Sergeant Mays. I was then marched to a waiting paddy wagon down the road. Meanwhile, other media that had shown up at the same time as the police and were behind the yellow line zoomed their cameras in on me as I was marched away with my hands cuffed behind my back. Later that day, I had family members call me to tell me they saw me being arrested on TV like a criminal. I was taken to Edmonton Police Headquarters, searched, and put into a cold concrete cell and held for 5 hours. Upon my release, I was made to sign a notice to appear in court on February 1st and informed I was charged with obstruction. This experience has caused many sleepless nights and emotional distress. Not only was I impeded from doing my job of following police actions and the arrest and detainment of Roy Cardinal and a young woman who was also arrested that day, but I've also struggled with feelings of humiliation and fear. Fear and humiliation about the personal and professional consequences of being convicted of a criminal offense. I've questioned my ability to continue doing the work that I do, that I'm so incredibly passionate about doing, and whether the personal sacrifices we as journalists make to do this work are worth it. However, I'm resolute in my belief in the importance of this work that I and every other journalist in the world does. I believe that witnessing the actions of and holding to account society's most powerful figures is at the very core of what journalists do. And I will not allow my arrest to silence or undermine the powerful legacy of work I have built up. The interference and arrest of journalists by the police is alarmingly becoming the norm, as you've heard here today. It's a deliberate attempt to diminish, belittle, and intimidate us, aiming to instill fear, silence our voices, and undermine our professional credibility. And the public should be gravely concerned that the criminalizing of journalists is the new status quo in Canada. In Iraq, China, Russia, or other totalitarian countries, reporters and journalists face persecution, arbitrary arrests, and are even killed for merely fulfilling their duty of reporting the truth. These oppressive actions perpetuated by dictatorial regimes aim to suppress, intimidate, and manipulate the masses by conveying propaganda that aligns with their regime's interests. A free press can never be taken for granted, but such flagrant violations of human rights and press freedom are infiltrating Western society at an alarming rate. And escalating aggressions against journalists should be a dire warning to us all. A journalist can only cover what they can access. And because I stood up for my right to access police interactions with vulnerable citizens, I am being punished. A criminal charge simply for doing my job. This threatens to erode a fundamental pillar of a strong and free democracy. I pray the Crown will come to its senses and throw out my criminal charge, because if it goes forward, it's a trial that will test and shake the innate principles of our democracy that we all hold dear. And it's a terrifying indicator of the dark places we're headed as a society. I want to express my deepest gratitude to Ricochet Media, who's wholeheartedly stood by me, my lawyer, Rick Marasti, and to all the incredible media and human rights organizations that are here supporting me today. Hi, hi.
Thank you so much for those powerful words, Brandi. Before we move to questions, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Brandi's first appearance in court is this Thursday, and tomorrow on Tuesday, she has to report to the Edmonton Police Headquarters to be fingerprinted. She's going to do that at 11, and so Brandi and her lawyer, Richard Marasti, will have a brief media availability outside of the Edmonton Police Headquarters tomorrow at roughly 11:30 a.m. local time. So that's for any Edmonton media that would like to get visuals. That will be an opportunity to do that. The other thing I wanted to mention before we go to questions is just that as you listen to all of this, there's a bit of an internal question, which is that on the one hand, this is a ridiculous charge, and Brandi obviously did not do what the offense describes. And so therefore we feel very confident that she won't be convicted. But at the same time, and on the other hand, every time that you go into a courtroom for anything is a roll of the dice, and you can't be assured of the outcome. And so there is a very real risk here that Brandi could go to jail for up to 2 years for doing her job. And so I do want to want to keep the emphasis on that, even as we make the case that this is ridiculous, that they should drop it, that no conviction is likely to happen. That is the risk that we're facing. So now we're going to proceed to questions. Please use the raise hand function, or if you're having some problem with that, you can put a note in the chat. And when you start speaking, please tell us who you're directing your question to, so we know who to ask to respond. Okay, so please go ahead and raise your hands if you would like to ask a question.
The lack of questions tells me how much of a slam dunk, ridiculous thing this is.
Okay, last call for questions. Anybody, please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Yes, Chrissy, can you repeat the hashtag we should use? Yeah, so it's hashtag stand with Brandi. And there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out later today. We're going to put together a press release that includes quotes from some of the speakers today and distribute that. There's statements coming out. As I mentioned, PEN Canada has released around 40 minutes ago a statement saying much the same that you've heard from everyone else here today, and you can access that on their website or on the Newswire. And we remain available if you have any questions. If there's anything you need for your stories, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'll just give my phone number if anybody wants to take it down. It's 514-662-0070. That's 514-662-0070. And feel free to call me anytime, Ethan Cox. Okay, so before we wrap up here, does anybody...
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm so sorry. I'm struggling to find my raise hand thing on my tiny phone.
That's okay.
I just want to say this really concerns me in terms of our democracy and the cornerstone that is the free press. What can us citizens do to put pressure on, other than maybe social media and using the hashtag? What else can we do that is meaningful support for Brandi and journalists in Canada to push back against this egregious charge?
That's a great question. Did you have anyone in particular in mind you're asking?
I'm not sure who to ask. I guess my first thought would be ask Brandi that, but yeah, whoever has the ability to answer that, I'd be happy to hear from. Thank you.
I would say, Ethan, thank you so much for that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing that we're trying to do this week is put pressure. We want to make it very clear that the public does not accept what is happening here. And so definitely going on social media, using the hashtag Stand With Brandi, tagging the Edmonton police, tagging the mayor of Edmonton, Amarjeet Sohi, and sharing the statements from the various organizations, sharing our press release later today and the stories that come out in the days to come. It's really a question of needing to raise the alarm about this. Something wrong and bad is happening here, and so it's important that we raise the alarm. So, in particular, democratically elected representatives. So obviously this happened in Edmonton. The mayor of Edmonton, your city councillor are great people to ask questions of. Why is this happening? Don't they have control over the police department? You may get less of a positive reaction, but Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, your local member of the Legislative Assembly in Alberta, those are good people to talk to. And if you're outside of Alberta and Edmonton, then also you can try reaching out to your MP, although it's a bit more indirect. So
I just wanted to briefly say, this is a very good question. And I think more than what we're noticing in Canada is these cases happen, and then sometimes press freedom groups and human rights groups do mobilize. But I think that it is very important that we have pressure from the citizen. And like you said, and I just wanted to emphasize on that, it's really important to write to a public representative, to your MP as well. I think that everyone should participate in that, call your MP and call public representatives to, to emphasize your interest in this case and how you think that this is problematic for you as a citizen.
Thank you so much. We'll go to Catherine and then Brent, who have their hands up.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, just kind of echoing what everyone else said. I think remembering that the government is there to serve you, and if you're not happy with it, then you should register your complaints. And also just talking about it with, with your friends, family members. I think frequently we end up kind of siloed, understandably so, right? But people don't realize what's happening in their own community. And if they did, I'm sure they would be horrified. So just kind of making sure to bridge that gap. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Brent, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that, we're here today, obviously, to support Brandi, but sort of taking a step or two back and looking at this from the wider picture. This is not something that's isolated to Edmonton. Similar actions have happened in Vancouver, in Halifax, in Toronto. We've seen some stuff in Ottawa. This is a pervasive, and in Winnipeg as well, this is a pervasive problem. And no matter whether this is not a one-off, this is part of a playbook that law enforcement is slowly adopting. And what they're seeing is that they can increasingly get away with it because, detaining or arresting a journalist is in many ways the perfect crime. It deters, the journalists from doing their work and from producing, and producing material and holding authorities to account. And it sort of puts them on the back foot. So I think, major agencies and democracy demands that we, respond in kind. And that means putting pressure on people. But I think, we need to remember that this is not just an isolated incident. As much as we're here to support Brandi today, that there are so many journalists who are experiencing similar kinds of behavior, as Kieran was mentioning, both online and in 3 dimensions. So thank you.
Thanks, Brent. And we have a couple questions in the chat. Did it make national news, English and French? It did. There was a lot of coverage when this happened. There was a Canadian Press story, a Toronto Star story, and stories in a number of TV and radio news, CBC, what have you. So yeah, it made big national news. How is it different for a citizen to be charged with obstruction from a press member? That's perhaps more of a legal question, but it is the same legal charge. It is a criminal charge. So there's nothing specific to a journalist about it. It just shouldn't have been laid. Okay, so do we have other questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, I don't see any. I want to thank you all so much for being here today. I want to thank all of our speakers and their organizations for their wonderful and steadfast support. Brandi and we here at Ricochet deeply appreciate it. Again, there's going to be a lot of action this week. We invite media in Edmonton to go out to the Edmonton Police headquarters tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. local time for a brief statement from Brandi and her lawyer Richard and a photo opportunity. There will be a first appearance in court on Thursday. There will be a lot of action on social media, a lot of statements coming out. So please do follow at Ricochet_EN. Please amplify statements from all of these organizations from us and look out for our full release later today. And I think that's it. Thank you all so much. Brandi, we're here for you. We're standing with you, and we're going to get this charge dropped. Thank you all so much for being here. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Yeah, I feel a lot better because it was really rough for a bit. So anyway.
Good.